Welcome to the Boxing Gossip channel. Please hit subscribe if you are new. George Groves advances to the final of the World Boxing Super Series. Unanimous decision. Scores are 117, 112, 116, 112, 115, 113. The BG scorecard had 115, 113 to George Groves, or maybe 116, 112. Those were the scores that I was instantly happy with after the result. Having said that, whilst I had it relatively competitive on the scorecards, 8-4 or 7-5, this was a clear win for George Groves. A clear win for George Groves. I thought George Groves put in a very, very good performance, and I thought Chris Eubank Jr. put in a performance that was rather underwhelming, and that was quite disappointing for a Eubank Jr. fan perspective. The fight in many ways resembled a similar pattern to the Billy Joe Saunders versus Chris Eubank Jr. fight. I've scored the first 4 rounds of this fight to George Groves, and I didn't think any of those rounds were overly complex to score. I thought it was 4-0 after 4. Groves comes out, he's moving well, he's jabbing well, he's feinting well. Eubank is slow to start. We talked about this in the pre-fight build-up. We talked about how Chris liked to stand off, look at his opponents, jab a bit, and I kind of talked that if he did that with Groves in the early rounds, he'd just be giving those rounds up to George Groves. And that's what he did. That's what he did, because Groves really found the going fairly easy in those early rounds, those first 4 rounds. Groves really showed he has a very substantial advantage over Chris Eubank Jr. from long range. His jab was on point, he was moving well, he was feinting nicely, and Eubank became tentative. Eubank struggled to deal with the moving boxing opponent. We know he struggled to deal with that kind of opponent when he fought Billy Joe Saunders. Subsequent to that Billy Joe Saunders fight, he's fought flat-footed guys. He's fought guys who don't have the same boxing pedigree, who don't have the same movement, and he spent his time hitting the wall bag in that gym in Brighton. People like myself sat back, and I kind of thought that Chris Eubank Jr. had improved. Kind of thought that he'd advanced in those areas of his game. But fundamentally tonight, those same flaws were yet again exposed. And whenever Groves was able to show him jab and a bit of movement, I personally thought Chris Eubank Jr. struggled. What impressed me about George Groves more tonight was in the early to middle parts of this fight, I thought he was closing down Chris Eubank Jr. very nicely. When Jr. came in, Groves was able to hold, to frustrate, to stifle. He was able to use his size and his experience on the inside to kind of avoid engaging with Chris Eubank Jr. on the inside and kind of nullify and frustrate Chris Eubank Jr.'s work. After about 8 rounds, I think I had George Groves something like 5 or 6 rounds up after 8. I thought he was making very, very easy work in the fight indeed. And I think rounds, 6, 7 and 8 were still very, very, very comfortable George Groves territory. Eubank was frustrated. He was lunging in. He was very wild. He was very inaccurate. He was very off balance. A few times he, either dipped or he almost went down or even did go down. Not saying they were genuine knockdowns at all, but just saying he was so off balance and he was so wild and swinging and inaccurate. He was almost taking himself off his feet for times in the fight. Groves was feinting well. When Eubank Jr. did come in, Groves was timing him quite nicely. And one thing that was surprising to me was how elusive George Groves was able to be. When Eubank Jr. cornered him. Even when Eubank had him up against the ropes, George Groves was able to dip under punches. He was able to pivot out, wheel away from Eubank. He was able to avoid, Eubank Jr.'s punches. He's got great hand speed, but he telegraphs his work quite a bit. He's so wild and so inaccurate at times that Groves was able to be quite evasive in the fight. And, after about 8 rounds, Groves was very, very comfortably up. Going into the last third of the fight, there was always the suggestion that George Groves would start to tire, that George Groves' battery would start to run out. We've seen it happen time and time again. But I felt Groves' stamina held up in rounds 9 and 10 quite nicely, actually. Potentially because he'd had the first 2/3 of the fight so easily his own way, he hadn't had to expend as much energy. Let me put it this way. I think over the first 8 rounds of the fight, I've seen fighters cause Groves a hell of a lot more problems than I saw Eubank Jr. Christopher Abrase, Dennis Douglin, Fedor Chudinov, Jamie Cox, maybe even Martin Murray. All of these guys caused more problems for George Groves than Chris Eubank Jr. did in those first 2/3 of the fight. It was very, very good boxing from Groves. The jab and move and the way he was able to nullify Eubank's style, very impressive. From a Eubank perspective, very, very disappointing how sort of wild, how inaccurate he was. And Eubank, you kind of get this impression he's one of these guys who doesn't really have that plan B to his game. If he's not able to implement his style, if he's not able to land those 50 uppercut punch combinations on the inside, he's not someone who's going to be able to reinvent himself and find something different, which was, to be expected. But I was quite surprised how easy Groves was wheeling away from Eubank's best work, and really quite surprised how Groves was able to nullify some of Eubank's work. The last third of the fight was probably more Chris Eubank Jr. territory. I can't remember the exact rounds, but of the last four, I think I might have scored 3, maybe even all 4 to Chris Eubank Jr. He was coming on strong. He was forcing the pace. Groves appeared to sustain a very, very bad injury in the last round or two. I'm no doctor, maybe he dislocated his shoulder, it seemed to have popped out of place, he wasn't able to throw that lead hand, and the last round was nerve-wracking times for George Groves. He showed a huge amount of heart, but his hands were down by his waist, and he was fighting one-handed. He was still timing Chris Eubank Jr. with a one-handed uppercut as Eubank came in, but he probably wasn't able to hold and to nullify as he had been doing throughout the course of the fight. And as such, he had some very, very scary moments in that last round when Eubank was rampaging and coming on strong. The last 15-20 seconds of the fight are ultimate drama. And if you watch that last 20 seconds, it does appear that George Groves could potentially get stopped in the last round. But he shows huge heart, huge determination to come through that last round. And he wins a clear decision on all 3 judges' scorecards and on my scorecard. Huge credit goes to George Groves. Huge credit goes to George Groves. Eubank did sustain a bad cut over his eye early on in the fight. Clearly that was to his detriment. Clearly it was very frustrating for him. Having said that, it probably wasn't a cut, it was to the side of the eye. It didn't appear from my position that it was blinding him and that it was preventing him fighting, although obviously not ideal. Where do the guys go from here? For Chris Eubank Jr., this is the second defeat, and it's the second time he stepped up to that sort of world-class level. It's no surprise to me that Eubank Jr.'s 2 losses have come when he's faced guys with a jab and a move game. He's a guy who's very, very, very devastating when he's allowed to tee off his style, tee off those uppercuts, tee off those 50 punch combinations against flat-footed guys. I'd have thought, I predicted Eubank to win the fight. I thought he would find something more going into this matchup, but unfortunately he didn't. And now at 28 years old, now having his second loss, with similar themes running throughout both of his first 2 losses, you have to wonder if that will be a kryptonite throughout the course of his career. He did look small in there compared to Groves. I've speculated in this channel time and time again, it'll be very hard for Eubank Jr. as he gets older to go back down to 160. I know the Eubank crowd believe he can make 160, but this is a guy who was starting to miss weight on multiple occasions when he was campaigning against about middleweight. Now he's getting older. Now he's had several fights at super middleweight. I think it's going to be very, very hard for him to go back down. Eubank's performed with credit. He's shown heart. He's shown a chin. He's shown good spirit to remain in this fight and to go the distance. Having said that, I think some of the mystique and some of the aura around Chris Eubank Jr. is again shattered with this loss. And I don't think there'd be too many people picking him to win in a rematch against Groves or a rematch against Billy Joe Saunders, for that matter. Fundamentally, Eubank is probably just lacking in fundamental boxing technique and skills. As for George Groves, a career-defining victory for him. He answers a lot of his critics. People like myself thought he'd be simply too vulnerable for a fighter like Chris Eubank Jr., thought his stamina may be too weak to last those difficult late rounds. He's answered a lot of questions, and even though George Groves has had tough losses in his career to the likes of Frotz and Badu Jack, he's had fantastic wins against the likes of James DeGale, Fedor Chudinov, and now against Chris Eubank Jr. Groves goes into the final of the World Boxing Super Series. Whoever he's in against, be it Bramer, be it Callum Smith, he's going to start as a substantial favourite, I should imagine, against both of those guys. Let's see how his shoulder recovers, or his arm, or whatever it is he's injured. Let's hope that doesn't affect his participation in the tournament. Eubank can certainly come again. He's a very, very good fighter, but he's a fighter with frailties. He's a fighter with flaws, and that got sewn up again tonight. Disappointing that Chris Eubank Jr. hasn't improved. Disappointing that the frailties in his game that were exposed in that Saunders fight haven't yet been ironed out. And disappointing that he kind of allowed Groves to take such an early lead and waited too late before implementing his game plan. Huge credit goes to George Groves. Huge credit goes to his trainer, Shane McGuigan, for coming up with a real solid, good game plan. Groves answers a lot of questions and scores what was an upset win in the eyes of the bookmakers. Let me know your thoughts. How did you score this fight? What did you make of both guys' performances? Please leave your thoughts in the comment section below. If you've enjoyed this video or any of the content I've done in the lead up to this fight, please hit subscribe so you can check out all of my other stuff. Please also hit the thumbs up button. That'll mean this video gets a bit more visibility and new people checking it out. Many thanks as always for tuning in.